Lola.
And we have Lola, of course. So, welcome.
I mean, it's important to know that there's a dog walking across the sidewalk.
Lola is welcoming everyone to Hosted Bar. I'll let Erin take it from here while I go on mute and take care of the dog.
All right. Welcome, everyone, as always, to the Hosted Bar. Today, we have Leah Rope from The Perk to talk about culture and like what's reality versus what's a buzzword. But more importantly than all of that, Leah, how are you doing and what are you drinking?
I am doing so well. Happy Friday. Very excited for Friday. Today, I am drinking from Moore Brewing Company, the Consolation IPA, and it's holding a little trophy and it says, "You tried."
I love it. Where's Moore?
We'll try today to figure out what it's this whole culture thing. Yeah. So I am drinking Small and Small nice. Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough, New Zealand. And I had a bottle of this, I don't know, a month or so ago. And now I'm like, well, crap, now I have to keep buying it because it's good. Like, it is going to be a perfect summer wine. If you are not showing your video.
Not to you.
Okay.
Everybody else
so
can see it.
Then I can't see if you're drinking anything fun. So you'll just have to explain it to us in words.
I am drinking a 2016 New Glarus Ode Bruin. It is basically a sour porter of sorts. It's a Belgian style dark sour beer. It's delicious. It's one of my favorites, and it's, I don't know, 5 years old at this point. So that's kind of nice.
It can go into kindergarten now.
It can go into kindergarten at this point. So
you know what? Before we jump into culture, do you remember how we all met for a second?
I do.
Won at a YMCA auction a craft beer tasting event hosted by Jeff. So Jeff came to our house and hosted for me and my friends like a craft beer tasting event and taught us all about the beer. And it was, our friends still talk about it. It was one of the best nights ever.
That was a ton of fun. I always loved doing those. They got to be, it got to the point where I was doing like 10 of them a year. And I was like, oh my God, this is just like, I have a job, man. I can't do all of these. But I love doing them. They were so much fun. And I would donate them to miscellaneous nonprofits and would go do them. And they were great. And I loved it. And the one that we did at your guys' house was just so much fun. It was a lot of fun. Met a lot of people there that I'm still friends with today. Like today, I'm still friends with quite a few of the people who were there.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. That's great to hear.
Yeah, so it was a lot of fun. So, Erin, I'm actually going to sneak in priority here for getting started.
For sure.
And the reason is because I think the questions I'm going to ask are going to lead into and help be maybe a good background for some of the questions.
Is the first question you're going to ask Leah, what is it that she does and why are we asking her about culture?
That could be the first question. Yeah, that would probably be a very good first question.
That'd be a fabulous one.
Yeah.
Because I've been telling a bunch of people to go to listen to Leah's culture community and things like that. So,
yeah.
Why are we asking you all these questions and expecting you to have answers?
Yeah, so this is my passion. This is my job. I love to do. So I own a company called The Perk, and we do leadership coaching and culture consulting. And then I also run a nonprofit called Culture Community. So we meet on a monthly basis. We bring in speakers to everything that helps us be better leaders and to build better cultures at our organizations. And I actually started Culture Community 5 years ago when my career as a CPA, and I was the VP of Finance and Operations at an organization and thrown into the world of HR and culture development. No idea what I was doing. So I looked for a group of people who could help me out or tell me if I was doing things right or what I was doing wrong or celebrate with me or cry with me, whatever. And no group existed. So we created Culture Community to bring all of us together who were interested in building culture. And yeah, so that's why I think you invited me today to talk about culture.
I love those culture community events. They're such great events. They're so positive, and the people who are there are really engaged and interested and active. The speakers are always super interesting, so I always love going to them.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
So I'll get started, and this is kind of Erin's going to say this is a typical Jeff question because it's going to start with what sounds like an overly researched question, because it's not actually an overly researched question.
It's a Jeff question.
Because it was just a book I happened to be reading this morning, and it happened to be relevant to what we're, at least I thought it was relevant. I think it's relevant, and that's going to be the question here: is it relevant or is it not? But the system is called Systems Thinking: Managing Chaos and Complexity, and they talk about obviously the book is about managing systems and thinking about businesses in terms of systems analysis and of the kinds of systems of the kinds of things that they're talking about that you have to be able to manage in order to manage a business or system properly. They talk about these ideas of what are called emergent properties. And these are as opposed to what are called like type 1 properties, right? Type 1 property is what were your sales, right? Something that's objective, easy to measure, right? And emergent properties are properties of the whole. They're not properties of the individual parts. And interestingly, the emergent property can't be deduced from the property of the parts. So an example here is the property of success. One can be successful or one can be not successful, right? But it can be hard to define success even if you have the metrics for the component of success. So emergent properties by their nature cannot be analyzed, and the compatibility between the parts creates a resonance which are in order of magnitude higher than the sum of the forces, right? So when you have emergent properties, when everything works, it actually makes the system work better. But when it doesn't work, the whole system doesn't work, right? Even though the individual components of it may appear to be working, right?
What do you mean that sounds over-researched?
I know. So I love this quote, and so I'm going to read this. Emergent properties are the spontaneous outcome of ongoing processes. Life, love, happiness, and success are not one-time propositions. They have to be reproduced continuously. If the processes that generate them end, the phenomena will also cease to exist. So if we look at the basic business property processes of something like success, we look at something like throughput, decision-making, learning and control, membership, conflict management. Without them, you can't be successful, but even with them, you may not be successful. Right? That's the idea of this emergent property kind of thing. So it seemed to me that culture is also an emergent property, right? You can have all of the components of culture, yet still not have a good culture, whatever that means. And we'll talk a lot about what good culture, bad culture means, I guess. But my question to you is, what are the components of culture? If I were to look at what are the process components that comprise a company's culture?
Yeah. If I were to break it down, and to be honest, I probably understood 15% of what you said.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good.
Right? You feel like you just got an MBA, like, because of that.
It was great. But if I had to break it down to like, what do I think are the foundational pieces of culture, regardless of what organization or group you have, it all comes down to trust, communication, and alignment. Like those are the three things. There are different ways to do them and build them. But at the end of the day, you need to have trust within the organization. You need to have alignment towards where you're headed and why. And you need to have strong communication. And really, when you boil it down to communication is what drives trust and alignment. So it's like if you had to boil it down even further, it's communication. And that's also how you build safety. It's how you build belonging. It's so trust, alignment, communication, but boiling it down even further, your one element would be strong communication.
And is this, I mean, to me, these seem like, you know, I'm along for the ride on those, but how are those measured? Or can they be measured? Like, am I thinking about this in the wrong way? Am I trying to be too objective about this? Or because there's necessarily some sense of subjectivity here?
No,
Or are they measurable?
they are measurable, but it's different. Each organization, and that's what's hard about culture, is it's like it seems so nebulous and so, I don't know, just complex. But like when you break down culture, like the definition of culture is it's your company's values and beliefs manifested in the behavior of everyone at your organization. So behavior is what builds culture. And so I've seen organizations measure culture in so many different ways. There are systems you can use to measure employees' engagement, measure employees' happiness, things like that. So that's how they're putting a metric or a number behind measuring that. Then that's also paired with subjective surveys or one-on-ones and things like that of how are people actually feeling? How connected to the team do you feel? So there are ways to measure culture. And then at the end of the day, it's like culture is kind of like a like leading and lagging indicators. It's kind of like when you're achieving the goals that you're setting out to achieve and you're achieving them in the right way, that feeling you have, that's also showing that you have the culture that's right for you. So it's like, yes, it's measurable, but it's different in how companies like to measure it.
It's almost like you measure the symptom.
Yeah.
Right? Like how many sneezes you have rather than germ load. Right? Mm-hmm. You can't really measure, okay, tell me on a scale from 1 to 10, how happy are you? Mm-hmm. But maybe you can, but I'm awful at those kind of judges, those measurements. But instead you look to say, okay, what do happy employees do? Let's see if they're doing it. And I would argue that if you're going to do that, it's really important to make sure that what you're measuring aligns with what you say has to happen.
Totally. And I think that's a big piece of it too, is like if companies or individuals say like, we want to measure culture, why? What's the purpose of it? Like, what are you trying to understand or see or track over time? So then pulling it back to there, like, what is the purpose? And then let's figure out the way in which we can measure that here.
Right. And so I guess this goes to kind of one of my initial questions is you hear the term culture a lot. I remember talking about like interviews and stuff you're supposed to ask back in the day, like, what is your culture? And now you're not supposed to ask that because it's like, what does it mean? And people throw the word around a lot, but does it still have meaning, or is it just something we say now? Or is there, kind of like you're saying, is there so many different meanings that it's kind of just disparate? So how do we know we're talking about the same thing? We're talking about culture.
I think that's a great question. And one of the most important things within an organization is that you all have common language. You come to a clear definition of what does culture mean here? How do we define it here? Another one is like productivity. Every company wants more productivity. They talk about productivity, but nobody takes the time to really be like, what do we mean by productivity here? And so if you go to a culture conference or an HR conference, anything like that, every speaker has their own definition of culture. So my definition that I use is your company's values and beliefs manifested in the behavior of everyone at your organization, because
I love.
Yeah,
it's built I like that a lot.
It's built by behavior, and it's every single person at your organization. Everyone, or in a group, everyone is building that culture. And I think Simon Sinek takes it even simpler. I think he said culture is values plus behavior. Culture equals values plus behavior. So it's really, you can define it how you want to at your organization, but get a definition and make sure it's common language and it's commonly understood what culture means here. And then in interviews, you can say, here's what culture means to us here. Like, you can use that as a learning opportunity for them and then ask them questions around it.
So one of the things that I think about, well, one of the questions that was sort of occurring to me, and I think you've answered this, and I just want to make sure I'm hearing it correctly, because I think I'm starting to get this a little bit. But the question I was going to ask is sort of, what's the scale for culture for like, is it you have culture or don't have culture, or you have good culture or bad culture? But what I think I hear you saying is you have cultural fit or you don't have cultural fit, right? That, somebody either fits with what you're trying to achieve, your values and behavior, or they don't. Not necessarily that a culture is good or bad.
Yes, I would say I don't think there's any such thing as a good or a bad culture. Is the culture right for this organization? And then you as an individual thinking, is this a culture that I want to be a part of? That the culture I'm seeing, which is built by these behaviors, these are the behaviors I want to do every day. So there are cultures that I personally think are bad, but that's my own judgment and opinion based on the cultures I want to be a part of. So I don't think there is inherent good culture, bad culture. There's the right culture for your unique organization. And then as an individual, you decide which cultures are in alignment with your own values and behaviors.
So I definitely see, like, both of yours. I think Jeff's thing is like, it's not good, bad, or it's fit for me, right? It's fit for you. But I'll say one of the things that I'm scared of is there is no such thing as an absence of culture.
Right.
There's always something there. And so one of my fears is like the unintentional culture, or the and you were saying you have to define it, the undefined. So, the reality of what's going on in the ground versus the high and fancy words that are on the email or on the website or in the interviews. So how do we make sure the intent, the culture that we say we have is the one that we have? How do we define it? Because that's one thing I've struggled with. I mean, we've had this firm for 5 years, and I'm always trying to, like, how do I put this into words?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do with clients is we define your core behaviors, like core values. That's what everyone does, right? We all get core values when we start our businesses. These are going to be our values. Core values, though, are actually kind of abstract. They're big, they're lofty. They can mean different things to different people. Having fun at one organization is different than having fun at another one. Respect, loyalty, all of those like buzzwords for values can mean something totally different at organizations. You can have a team of people at the same organization and they define all of those differently. So it's that common language piece. So what we do with organizations, we actually take it a step further. So we say, okay, what are the behaviors that will build the culture that you want here? So we figure out, like, where do you want to go? What does success look like for you? Where are you at today? And what are the behaviors that will take you? And we explore too, what are some things you've been doing that you and your team need to stop doing? Not because they're necessarily bad behaviors, but they're just not going to serve you any longer. They're not going to take you to where you want to go. So it's actually a 3-step process. We first define what are the behaviors, and then we write them out. Then we teach them to the team. Again, if you as a leadership team know what the behaviors are and nobody else in the organization does, it requires everyone to build a culture. So then you teach it to your team. And then the step 3 is internalize. Culture is not something you can talk about one time. It's something that has to become part of your daily behavior, because again, your daily behavior is what builds culture. And so we help companies put in routines and rituals to be able to talk about these behaviors on a consistent basis, so people are living and doing these behaviors.
So I guess this leads to another question. I often think of culture as an executive as my job or my thing, but I've also been in business in jobs where clearly the executive was not on top of that. Right? Like, they might have been thinking they were working on a culture, but it was not what was happening. So whose job, quote unquote, is culture? Is it someone who's got the title of chief cultural officer? Is it exactly, where does that kind of lie?
So there's not one person who can own the culture. It requires everyone doing it together. And I like to think of it like an orchestra. Like, you can have someone who is conducting, who's the conductor, but everyone has to be in their seats with their instruments, playing the same song. Nobody's in the audience. Nobody's watching the culture get built. Everyone is in this orchestra. And for the conductor, this can be someone, in the people ops team or whatever, but the CEO, the main leadership team, you really need to be bought in. You need to care. If you asked me 5 years ago if I thought, culture could be built from, the grassroots up, I'd be like, yeah, absolutely, we can do it. Unless your leadership team and executives are bought in to what's happening, they don't need to be a part of everything, but unless they're bought in and actually doing those behaviors, you're not going to get very far. So, does that answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it raises a really interesting question, which is, what happens when the employees sort of hijack the culture, or there isn't sort of the conductor, right? You don't have a conductor, or the conductor isn't a very good conductor, right? What happens when the employees sort of, I don't know, maybe hijack is too strong of a word, but sort of take the culture and make it their own?
But the inmates start ruling the asylum.
You know what I pictured? I pictured it like Sister Act 2, in the music class, just like.
Yeah, exactly. What happens when you're in Sister Act 2 and Whoopi Goldberg is standing at the front of the class with her hands thrown up in the air, trying to figure out how she's going to control this unruly mess?
I believe that this requires me to pour more wine before we get into the Whoopi Goldberg Sister Act 2 portion of the evening.
I was going to say, if that happens in your culture, call Whoopi, bring her, she'll figure it out.
Yeah, she might bring some of the products that she's been marketing lately to help you chill out a little bit.
Yeah. No, I think, if that happens and you as the leader, the executive, the CEO are like, this, like a culture is there. A culture is not absent. So if that culture is not going to take you and the organization where you think it needs to go, then that's when you need to reset. You need to level set. You need to get clear on what are the behaviors I'm seeing that I want to and why? What are the behaviors we need to start doing? Like, get clear on those behaviors. Because again, behaviors are easier to teach. They're easier to define. They're easier to provide feedback on. They're easier to coach than like, you're not living the love everybody value. It's like, I feel like I am. No, you're not. You're not living it. It's, so.
I love that.
Taking that time to level set and getting super clear on what does it mean to love everybody here? How do we actually translate that into behavior? Or call it.
It's kind of like that whole thing about what is your love language? Is it, cooking food? It's like, what is your company's love language? Or what is your company's culture language?
Mm-hmm.
Because mine could be very different than yours. It could be very different than someone else's. But, and I think this goes with some of the conversations that I've been having lately with people outside of our organization, is that it can help both your thing, but it also can help you recognize good partners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And be like, oh my gosh, you and I talk the same language. That means our clients are going to talk the same language.
Yes, absolutely. Culture is something that's not just felt like within the organization. It is definitely felt with, your clients, the vendors you work with. It doesn't like stay in this nice container. It seeps out. And it should, because then it brings in other people that are aligned with your values and behaviors.
So I'm a science nerd, and I worked in labs and things like that. So whenever I hear culture, I automatically think like bacteria and yeast and things like that. So it totally makes sense. It's kind of like a good mold.
So, but one of the things I think is really interesting, I'd like to hear about, how dynamic should culture be, right? That, you're going to have, by necessity, you're going to have at least a little bit of sort of top-down control, right? There's a conductor of sorts. But how much do you let the employees riff or do their solos on top of your corporate culture, right? Or let them sort of tell you that the culture should be changing in a slightly different direction, right? That maybe the culture that was appropriate 5 years ago doesn't resonate with employees today.
Totally. And I think culture exists no matter what. We've talked about that. Culture is constantly evolving. It's always changing. As you bring new people into the organization, people leave, new clients, new product, all that stuff. Like culture is constantly changing. And I think that, you need to be really open to that and listening to employees, they're going to shift their cultures differently based on who they are or how small they are. You know, I have a 3-person company. Like, if we want to make a big culture shift, we can do it pretty quickly. We can probably do it by tomorrow.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know? But I love that idea. I've never thought of it like that, of allowing your team to have solos. I think that that's a really cool concept. And also, you know, I've worked with organizations where certain teams, like, we have the core behaviors, but then certain teams interpret it and like kind of add onto it in a way. And I think as a leadership team, you have to be open to that, but then also knowing that if it's not going in the direction you want.
I'll give an example. I want to give an example of this real quick, Erin, if you don't mind. Because I have a really good example of this. Before I was a lawyer, I was a software developer, and I worked for Fortune 500 companies. And my team inside of the Fortune 500 company, this was a very boring Fortune 500 company. They made they didn't make semiconductors, but they were a computer like value-added reseller. So if you needed to set up a server farm at your business, they would sell you all the computers and come install it. But my team inside of that
server farms
company,
are always exciting. What are you talking about?
But my team inside of that, we were 8 people or 6 people, and we were really sort of left to do our own thing. And so we literally had a room that was that you know, it had no noise got out of the room. We had posters all over the walls. We had pool tables. We had air hockey tables. We had, 500 CD changers. We decided that our team uniform was going to be orange prison jumpsuits. And so we would all show up at work wearing orange prison jumpsuits and just scare the crap out of everybody in the office. And they would never see us. The only time they would see us is when we came out of our hole wearing our orange jumpsuits. But it worked for us, and it turned out that it worked really well within the company too, because it was just sort of something that got everybody sort of moving and thinking and doing things differently.
But I guess I would caution that for every time that works for you guys to have that culture, because you had an internal group culture that really worked and it was symbiotic with what they needed. Mm-hmm. I've been in companies where when you let everyone be soloists, you don't have an orchestra.
Right.
And so I think you have to be very, I guess my word of 2021 already is mindful. You have to be really mindful about that, because I've been in organizations where you had all of these soloists and you were just like, I just want to get something done, and I don't even know, I have to learn 12 different rules.
Right. And I think it's, when you get clear on what is the culture that we want for the whole organization, those behaviors, the values, there's this continuous communication component where you're talking to everyone. But then, maybe the marketing department has this like very different thing or way of being than the finance department. But at the end of the day, you also have this like set of behaviors and things that you're all doing. That's what makes the culture. But you can have these little pieces that are a little nuanced and different. It's like the percussion section can wear orange jumpsuits because we're still all playing the same song and like in harmony with each other.
Right. To go with the music analogy, I like the idea of it's more like jazz, where you do riffs, as Jeff said, riffs on the same, you do interpretations on the same thing, but you don't have one person playing jazz and the other one person playing Tchaikovsky.
Right. I love the jazz metaphor. And yes, it's like you want to be like a cool jazz section and not like a high school band.
As somebody who used to be in a high school orchestra, I understand perfectly what you're going for there.
I don't have any musical background, so I'm playing in analogies that I probably shouldn't, but
As lead second violinist, I can tell you that what I played was often very different from what the first violinists were playing.
Oh, I love it. But, sometimes we think too, like, again, nobody's sitting in the audience, but a lot of times we feel like when we're building culture, sometimes executives feel like they should be in the audience watching what's happening. Or
it's interesting because I feel like, having been an employee and an employer, as an employee, I felt like I was both a performer and an audience member.
Yeah.
right? Because I was supposed to be involved, but I was also watching. Like, what is going on here? How am I supposed to act? How am I supposed to be in this world? Yeah, those are the words you're saying, but they're not matching up with what I'm seeing. So it feels like a lot of times as an employee, you are both a musician and an audience member.
Right. And I think as an employee, asking the questions and thinking to yourself, reflecting, how can I get out of the audience? And then as a leader, thinking, how do I get my people out of the audience? Like, it's culture is co-owned. Everyone has to be proactive. And so it's like taking the ownership as an employee to figure out, how do I get back in the orchestra? And also taking ownership as a leader of, like, how do I make sure people don't feel like they're not a part of this group?
Almost like you go back to what you started with. It's all about communication. And it's a two-way street. It's not just I tell you.
And trust is a two-way street, and alignment is a two-way street. I can't align a group if they don't want to be aligned. We can't build trust with each other unless we both want to build trust with each other. We can't communicate unless I want to talk and you want to listen, and vice versa. It's like it has to go together.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop.
I was going to say,
we are 30 minutes in.
30 minutes?
I know, it's crazy. Fastest 30 minutes of all time.
Yay, this was so fun.